everyone, and welcome back to GAP Gracepoint Online. It's really great to have you joining us, and thank you for joining us for another episode of What's the Issue? Just a reminder of what we're all about here at What's the Issue, and it's all about figuring out what are some big things that preteens are facing and how do we deal with them as the community members of our preteens. You may be a parent, you may be a guardian, an aunt or uncle, or anyone working with preteens, and you may want to find out a little bit more about how we deal with some of these issues. And so welcome to What's the Issue? Today joining us, we've got Hloni with us, and Hloni is a youth pastor here at Gracepoint, and we're really looking forward to chatting with you today, Hloni, so thank you. So we're going to jump straight into it. Today we are talking about this whole idea, this catchphrase that we get in society, and we so often hear it, especially when it comes to young boys, be a man.
Right.
Be a man. Now, I don't know what your experience of it is, but I've very much seen it. It's often in cases where the boy is being berated for having feelings or being sensitive or expressing an emotion other than like nonchalance. Maybe your experience is different.
Yeah. So for a bit of context on my end, I went to a boys' school. So the idea of manning up, the idea of being a man, is something that was almost in your face. And so my experience of it, has been even though the school I went to, for instance, and obviously even though we're teenagers at that moment, but much of what we expressed had come from our preteen days and what we have been taught and how we had been socialized leading up to that moment. And even though there was an appreciation, a general appreciation that there are different expressions of manhood, some men are feminine and so forth, but there was almost an expectation that everyone is masculine and is a man to a particular certain degree. How one of the ways in which this was expressed is by the expectation that everyone will trial for rugby. It's an expectation, no matter your preferences. It's a week-long camp at the school that builds up towards trials where everyone is playing rugby. And so that has always been there. And so it's like this expectation that, no matter your expression of manhood, no matter your preferences, no matter how you've been socialized, there's this expectation that as a boy, you are somewhat a possible option for the rugby team, the ultimate squad. But you also see it in how we are brought up. I remember I grew up in a township where school holidays, everyone plays soccer. If you don't play soccer, there is barely any space. I don't want to say there's no space for you in the community, but you find it very difficult to get that sense of belonging. And so there is a sense in which young men are socialized, even in their preteen years, towards becoming a man. Whatever society defines that as.
And it's interesting because very often it's like the sense of camaraderie around it, but we don't really realize that as much as it can have positive aspects like the camaraderie, like you're not alone if you wanted to try it for rugby, this is a great opportunity. Maybe if you were a bit shy and you were worried, this would have been a great opportunity to not feel like you were isolated. There's a camaraderie. But there's also that aspect of you're so socialized into this be a man environment that should you want to be a different expression of what it means to be a man, you would be ostracized or isolated from the community. So there's both positives and both negatives.
Sure.
Now, obviously we're speaking at the preteen age. At preteen age, they're very much starting to develop their identity. They're starting to look at, where do I fit into society? What are those things? Obviously, this develops a little bit further in the teenage years, but they're at the cusp of this, I knew who I was before as a child, and now you're entering this completely different phase. So how does this now start to maybe disrupt the development if it's not managed in a healthy way, this whole be a man?
Sure. So, Els, maybe let me start off by saying my theories and my understanding of identity has grown to acknowledge that though it is a big developmental task in your teen years, it is something that you are busy with your whole life. From the moment you separate from your mom, when you are born you already start developing and getting a sense of self. Who am I? You're already starting to define that. Now, for a lot of parents in a world that has positioned men One, because of obviously, from our hunting and gathering days, you would need men to build houses, to hunt, and so forth.
To be the strong one.
To be the strong one, but also because of our tendencies of wanting to create pyramids in society and therefore positioning men in a particular place. We have created the world to become this place where, as a man, you need to be a particular kind of man in order to look after your family, even though that has been slowly but surely disrupted. But now the reality is, the older you are, the more of that world, or rather the more intense your experience of that kind of world would be, kind of society would be. And so, as a parent, you are always raising your child based on your experiences of society.
Yes.
And so you operate from a place of warranted fear from your perspective. But from their perspective, because the world is changing and they're experiencing a different world, it is unwarranted. And so as a parent, you don't want to find your child one day in life struggling to meet ends meet, or your child struggling to protect their family, and therefore you're going to employ or rather you're going to bring them up in a way that is informed by your experience of the world. And at times, unfortunately, because the world is also changing, our experiences may not necessarily be aligned to what the world is becoming, and we can make mistakes in the process. I've been very diplomatic, but we definitely can make mistakes.
Very much. And I hear what you're saying. As a parent, you're trying your best with your child. You can only parent from your background, your story, how you've been shaped and molded. And as much as you may try in your family or in your home space to disrupt this negative aspect of BeAMan that there could be, the reality is that your child is in a community where there are many, many influences.
Absolutely.
So even if you are not like, BeAMan, rub some dirt on it, for your son or for your child, they might be friends with somebody whose parent really does ascribe to that kind of.
Sure.
So how as a parent do we kind of shape and start to think about masculinity in a different way and teach our children to deal with it so that it becomes a healthy, nurturing space rather than a berating, you can't have emotion, negative environment?
Sure. So it's very important, one, for parents to own that a particular developmental aspect of their children's identity. Had we been speaking many years ago, the idea of it takes a village to raise a child, even though it is, the coining is very African, but I don't think it's exclusive to African traditions, African communities. Had we been speaking many years ago, we would say, be mindful of those who your child is exposed to in the community, in the village, be mindful of the village you belong to, but we are speaking today where villages have high walls, and therefore the village is now the social agencies in your child's life. Your social agencies are your schools, your church, the people they're exposed to, and so forth, these different institutions that play a role in their lives, but even more so, social media.
Yes.
You have no control over some of the stuff your child is exposed to, but some you have control over.
And very often it's on social media. There's
very
so much
exactly,
of
you know
this
what I'm
stuff
saying?
on social media.
And so for me, one, where you've got control, you need to make meaningful decisions. What school does my child go to? What is being taught at kids' church? What is being taught at GAP? Are they being taught that David was justified to do what he wanted to do? To look at when they look at the story of David, do they consider the fact that is it Bathsheba?
Yes.
That she was a woman who had been exploited? The idea of God's taking, do they consider those kind of things? Do they consider that man and woman are made in the image of God, and therefore femininity and masculinity are both something of God? Do they consider all of that? Consider the school, consider everything, all of that. But where you've got no control, give your child the tools, or create a relationship with your child where they can freely chat about some of the ideas they are picking up, so that it's something that is natural and so forth. But if anything, do not completely outsource the development of your child's identity. You need to be involved as a parent, and you need to given even, we've got our limitations as parents, my child will be a preteen one day. In light of our own limitations, offer the best contribution we can to equip them to continue with their own development.
I think it's so important what you mentioned, and just this whole thing of the intentionality around it.
Sure.
So I can just imagine there might be some people that would watch this and be rolling their eyes at this point, being like, you've really missed it. Being a man is not about all these negative things that you've portrayed it to be. It's this whole thing of take responsibility, own up,
Sure.
Contribute. There's that positive aspect. We've spoken very heavily about the negative aspect now. So how do we then, as parents, as our last question, how do you then as a parent or as a community member or as a guardian, anyone who is working with a preteen,
Sure.
how do we raise them to really take responsibility, to contribute to society? Now, obviously, that's a very broad question, but within the scope of this conversation, what are some of the ways that instead of just saying, just man up, be a man, how do we counter this and do it in a more healthy environment?
Sure. I think my first response would be the responsibility of many, or rather the idea of taking responsibility is a expectation that society has on every human. It is not an expectation that should be on men.
Yes.
Humans take responsibility. Humans own up. Humans take control of their lives. You see, when we emphasize it for the boy child, as though society is dependent on the boy child taking responsibility, the natural assumption from that is that the girl child does not have to take responsibility, or probably even more so, isn't capable of taking responsibility in such a way that moves society forward. So humans must take responsibility. Humans must take responsibility, know how to cook for themselves and so forth. But I think context also defines mandates. Because of the context we find ourselves in, young men need to be the ones that are prophets within their own boy community. They need to be the one that are disrupting the walls of patriarchy. So raise your boy child to be the one that does that. It's not women who will come into that space, but it is young men who need to be prophets in their own communities, in how they treat their female friends. They are starting to ask themselves questions around pornography. Are they going to engage these questions around their own sexuality in a way that objectifies women? Or are they going to engage it as something that is a healthy biological development that can be engaged meaningfully as we grow it through different stages of life? How do they see women versus how they see men? So all of those things for me, so we need to be able to say, okay, this is where my child is. This is what society looks like. What is the mandate of young men within this context? Not that it's inherent, but this is what they're needing to do in addition to their human responsibility.
And I think there's two folds to that as well. It's about acknowledging that in today's day and age, it's important for teens, especially once they've moved from this preteen, to take ownership, to take responsibility of the world. There's an age-old saying, the world is your oyster. But we're starting to see that our world is being shaped in such a way that unless teens or young adults are willing to be activists, they're going to really struggle. And so I think part of it is raising your children to acknowledge that it's okay to be an activist. It's okay to speak up about issues. Should someone ever address you and say, be a man, you're allowed to challenge that. Obviously, there's parents that will say, yeah, but it's disrespectful. There's respectful ways of doing it. But it's important, I think, to raise your preteens in such a way that they are not afraid to challenge the system in which they grow up. Not afraid to look at things a different way, because it will be different. Generationally, it's been accepted. This practice has been accepted. And for the world that we're living in and the way that we're going, if we truly want to see our preteens thrive, they need to be okay to be activists. So thank you, Hloni. Awesome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of What's the Issue. Please keep an eye out for the next time, and we really hope that this will help you as you parent or lead a preteen.